Good day, Roger. First of all, let me thank you for agreeing to do this video interview with me today over Zoom about your book, Performance Architecture.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I always like to talk about it. Not only that, I still use it.
Yes, no, I was going through it just recently myself. But let's for our audience, would you please introduce yourself and give us a little bit about your background in the performance improvement world?
Sure. My name is Roger Addison. I've been in the performance improvements for so many years, I can't even tell you. Actually, what was interesting is that I think I started when I was in high school, believe it or not. I had an opportunity to give an after-school job with a professor and a man by the name of Lloyd Haig, who studied under B.F. Skinner at the program instruction labs at Harvard. And so he and Jim Evans started an organization in Albuquerque, New Mexico, called Teaching Machines Incorporated. And they were looking for subjects to test out the programs. And I said, oh, that's interesting. By the way, Don Toasty also worked there, and he got me involved in testing some of the programs. So I just sort of grew up in the field. By the way, and they gave me 50 cents an hour to go through the programs. So I said, oh, that's, I can do that. So I think I got started in performance improvement in those days, and just had an unbelievable opportunity being around some of the most influential people in performance improvement, because they came to the lab. That's what they call it, the labs, Teaching Machines labs in Albuquerque. So Joe Harless was there, Bob Mager was there. So I got to meet all these people. And by the way, I had no idea that they were famous. At that time, they probably weren't famous either. So one of the things that we often did was had lunch on Saturday afternoon. So these people would join them for lunch, and I got to know a lot of people, hearing them talk about program instruction, which later became performance improvement. So I think I just grew up in the field around performance improvement, and I always thought that it wasn't necessarily the instructional side. It was more to it than trying to figure out what was going on, because that's how I was brought up under Lloyd Haig and Don Toasty, that you try to figure out what's going on and then work on some of the issues and the environment to support that. So I worked in their labs for a long time. Eventually, they were purchased by Westinghouse Learning Corporation, and an opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. to work at the Job Corps Center there, and learned a lot that way. And one day I asked how much people were making, and they said, and I found out they were making more money than I was. And I was doing the same job. And I said, well, what's going on here? They said, well, they had degrees and you don't. And I said, well, I can solve that problem. So I left that and started my educational aspect by going back to school. Eventually ended up at Baylor University to work on my doctorate under the work of a man by the name of Lou Bright. And Lou Bright was one of the, he started Westinghouse Learning Corporation and was just an amazing person and believed in our technology and supported me over those years. And finally, I got through school that way. So that's a very fast and brief how I got introduced to performance improvement.
Well, then you worked in the corporate world too a little bit. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I did. When I left Baylor University and said it was time for me probably to get a real job. So I moved back to California and worked for an organization called Operants, which was with Don Toasty again. And then eventually I decided maybe I'd get some opportunities to work in more of a corporate setting, and went to work for Wells Fargo Bank. And that was in the 1980s. And that was another great place to be, because Wells Fargo at that time was one of the best places in the United States to work. Now, it's had some changes over the years, but in the 1980s, it was a great place to do lots of experimentation and performance improvement. And the woman who hired me was probably one of the best bosses I've ever had, who understood performance improvement. That's why she hired me. And it actually was myself and 4 other people who were hired as performance consultants. And that one of the other people was Haig. And Haig was one of the co-authors with Lynn Kerny on the book. So again, we've had a long, long history of Lynn, Carol, and myself around performance improvement. And I know you see the name of the book is Performance Architecture, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the two co-authors are Lynn Kerny and Carol Haig, and it's called The Art and Science of Performance Improvement. And the art comes from Lynn Kerny. If you have an opportunity, go to Lynn Kearney's new webpage and see some of the arts that she's turning out now. It's spectacular. So I encourage you to do that. So she's kept up with the art side and not so much of the performance improvement side, although she does get involved every once in a while.
So after Wells Fargo, was it then that you went to work for ISPI, and was it NSPI?
I did.
Or was it
I did. I went
ISPI?
to work for ISPI. I did go to work for ISPI after Wells Fargo and worked there for about 10 years. And it was another great opportunity and experience. I worked on and developed a couple of the institutes for them that I ran with. One of the things I said about the institutes, I didn't want to just me standing up there talking about performance improvement. I said I would like to have practitioners involved and talk about how they did it and what they did to improve performance. And again, it was around performance improvement and not around, more or less training. So I had, Gary Rumler was one of the co-instructors, Klaus Wifkin was one co-instructors, Roger Kaufman was one of the co-instructors, Danny Langdon. I mean, it goes on about, and again, and I thought it was wonderful because can you imagine all the things I was learning along the way from these people? So another opportunity for me to learn.
Yes. No, I wanted to bring that out, that you've had, very practical experience doing this in a corporate setting, and then your involvement with ISPI, you've touched and influenced, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in terms of their own practices in this arena that's called performance improvement or human performance technology or simply performance technology. Of course, we've got a bunch of different names for these things here. But let's segue now into talking about your book. So I was going to start off with a four-part question here about, who were your co-authors, but you covered that for us, so we'll just skip that. But, who did you write the book for? And why did you write it for them? And, what were you hoping that their takeaways would be from this book?
Well, one of the things that, especially when I was working for ISPI, one of the things that always came up are what tools are out there and when do I use them? Because it was really, people were confused about, I thought they were confused at least, about what tools to use. So at that time, we started thinking about if we just start looking at the basic foundation of performance improvement, what would that look like? So that's where we started thinking about the 4 W's, we eventually called it. So that was the work, or the worker first, the work, the workplace, and the world. And I can talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But the idea is that there are tools along the way. If you find out if it's a people performance issue, well, there are tools that look at people's side. If there are a process, which is work issues, there are tools that will help you there. If it's the workplace, there are tools that help you there. And finally, if it's more or less the world. But by the way, one of the things that I had learned over the years, we talked about the worker, workplace, and world. I really thought about that. I said, if we think about the idea that maybe we should start at the world first and work backwards, it would make a lot more sense on looking at performance improvement issues. So it's the impact of the impact first, and then going backwards. I think probably would have written it maybe a little differently if we had to do it all over again today. Mm-hmm. Before I go on, it's just how performance architecture came about. And that's a real quick, I think it's an interesting story at least, is that I was over visiting Paul Harmon, and he was saying that he had some really interesting or new books on travel, because he knew I liked to travel. So he showed me the books, and I fell in love with the books on travel. And I looked in the back and I said, I wonder who wrote these books. There was a guy named by the name I'm blocking on his name right now, that he wrote the books, and he wrote, and he lived right down, he was right down the street from Wells Fargo. Mark Johnson, sorry, Mark. Mark Johnson is right down the street. And I said, well, and he had a really interesting name of his organization called the Understanding Business, which I thought was fascinating. I went down, visited him with one of the people I worked with, Kay Evans. She and I, at that point, Mark and I have been friends for the last 30 years. And I've done work with him, he's done work with me around performance architecture. And the reason architecture came about because he was an architect. So we started looking at our models, and he said, I do the same thing you do. And if you look at it from the standpoint of an architect, it becomes very obvious that we build things. And I think that you also picked up on the phrase architecture a long time ago also, because it just makes sense that we build performance improvement systems. And that's what I certainly learned along the way from Gary and working with him, that it is a performance system approach, not just one aspect of it, which was the learning field. And Dale Brethauer also, that's the model he introduced me to many, many years ago. And we've used that, simple but complex model for over the years.
Well, thank you for that. So let's walk through the various sections of the book, chapter by chapter, if you will. Okay. And you can maybe give us a little bit of an overview and maybe tempt the reader into finding the book and consuming it. But you start off, the first chapter is the performance technology landscape. So what's that about?
Well, one of the things that, again, when I was working with ISBI, is that we convened what we call a think tank around performance improvement. And so we had everybody I could think of at least attend the think tank, because it was really confusing to everybody on really what was performance improvement, because we were so model driven and everybody had their own model and was trying to figure out, well, what was this all about? And I said, if we can just really capture some of the commonalities of performance improvement, it maybe help not only my thinking, but maybe other people's thinking. So we came up with those things that all of the models had in common. And that's when actually ISPI turned more from model-based to the side of it being more principle-driven. So the principles were eventually became RSVP, and the R stood for, they were all results focused. They all ended up with the end in mind, what was the results they were trying to achieve. The S were systemic or systems thinking. So they all had systems thinking somewhere built into their models. The V was value, and that was the idea that we should probably try to prove what we did through some type of measurement. So value through measurement. And then the last one was, the P was that we probably need some partners out there. And partners were, generally speaking, who are we working for? And how do we get them involved of improving performance? And I knew working through Wells Fargo those many years is that I didn't have proper partners, nothing would get implemented. Because the only way you get sustainability is to get it into the organization and they own it. If the training department or performance improvement department owns it, it never gets implemented or part of the system. So that's what it came about. And then the rest of the 10 standards came about was more or less the standards around training and design, but it's also not training and design, it's how you improve performance by any type of an approach you would use. But it's usually looked at through the training aspects of it. I look at it through the standard of designing performance.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. So chapter 2 is titled The Worker, Individual and Team Level. So what's that all about?
Well, that's where we started, talking about, because you think about a lot of people, when the performance issues come to them, it usually is a people issue. And so we started with the models and the tools that would help us thinking about what would we need to look at for the performance issues. And one of the things that I really like is the work of Gary Rumler here, because he's got some of the troubleshooting things that you can look at, which we introduced in the book. And by the way, we went to visit with Gary for about 3 days before we wrote the book. And he was happy to show us all the things that he had. He just opened up his library for us. We acknowledged that in the very beginning of it. He actually wrote the preface or the introduction to it, to the book. And so we said, give us some troubleshooting aspects. And he had those, and I'd known those for years. And those were the first thing we tried to introduce. And then he has a nice job aid on analyzing performance systems, which I love. I use that model at Wells Fargo, and I suggest it saved thousands of dollars by asking the right questions, because Gary's got all the questions listed, what areas in the approach to use or the framework to use, and then get some diagnostics aspect. So I thought that was a really, really easy thing for me to use. And again, people would always, and then I also would turn it over to my clients and start asking them, because they would figure out, they would come to me with a training issue and very quickly would figure out, this isn't a people issue. This is something else issue. And usually it was something in the system that was getting in the way of basic optimal performance.
Thank you. So chapter 3 is titled The Work, Process, and Practice Level.
Well, I said, usually we found out the processes were not basically coordinated. And we figured out if we get the processes worked out, and that's when where we figured that out, was we were working with teller development at Wells Fargo, and there are hundreds of processes. And it used to be, we thought it was very complicated, but then going back to working with Mark Johnson, who helped me map them out and analyze through what they look like from that perspective, we figured out what those processes look like. And then from then on, we just started looking at the processes and doing process mapping and that kind of work. So there were some nice tools that, again, Gary introduced me to, going through his workshops around those process models. And if you have an opportunity to work on that. And by the way, I told you I work with Klaus Wipken, and Klaus has some, which are not in the book, but Klaus has some really great models around processes that we've incorporated. And I worked with him over the years now of incorporating some of those process models. So I encourage you to go to a great website. There's a plug too. It's called HPT Treasures. And on that website, as you know, Guy, are some wonderful tools and resources for the practitioner out there to use. And so you'll see some of these things also listed under there. You'll see everybody that's got tools and resources. And the other thing too, when I was at ISPI, Carol Haig and I did a series of interviews, much like, they weren't like this, but it was interviews over the telephone. We asked people about tools and resources, and we had published them on the ISPI website for years. And lo and behold, for some reason, they were taken down. So you recall, Guy, you called Carol Haig and I and says, I have a new idea. Let's start HPT Treasures. And so luckily, Carol had kept all of those copies. And so I put them all on there. And so they all do now exist, all the tools and resources that you'll see month after. No, there's over 100 on there.
Yeah.
That we did. So anyway, that's just a sign.
You have 10 years worth of monthly columns that you did on Trend Spotters.
Right.
But yeah, those were great resources. I'm glad we were able to kind of recapture some of the things that were lost and make them available to people. Your next chapter, then, chapter 4, is the workplace and the organization level. What do you cover in that?
Yeah, that one was the idea of saying, if we can look at the whole total performance system, and so we know the organization is a system. So we started using systems thinking around, what does the organization look like? So if you go to that chapter, you'll see a couple of the models that some of you are familiar with from Gary and Dale Breathauer. Again, because those are the people that I knew that were really systems thinking around performance improvement. Also, at that time too, is that Don Toasty wrote an interesting article about designing performance system. And we probably should design these things, which has a purpose behind them. So those are the things that we started introducing and thinking more about. What does this performance system look like, and how do they all relate? And again, there's some models in there from Gary around looking at the standpoint of the people, the process, the organization, and how do they all integrate with each other. Not only, another thing Gary talked about was the super duper system. And the super duper system is that what comes before and what comes afterwards, and all these have to be integrated. And by the way, you have clients out there, and not only that, you have stakeholders. So all these have to be looked at in order to manage a system. Now, a lot of people saying, oh, that really sounds complicated, but it really isn't if you just look at the pictures. And this is what I found was really great about working with Lynn Kerny. Lynn could take some of these concepts and put them into picture format, and people says, oh, I understand these now, they don't look so complicated. And again, taking about, and that was, we did these over 10 years at ISBI, where Lynn would come in at the workshops, and she would map out day by day, module by module, the pictures of how people saw these. Another side story was really kind of funny. Lynn Kerny and I went to Spain to do a workshop, and somebody came in, and she was doing the drawings behind me as I was doing the workshop. And somebody came up at the end of the workshop and said, what do you think we are, kindergarten people? That we had to have pictures? And we said, no, we thought that they would tell a good picture, a good story as we went along. And then after that, people started thinking about it. They do tell a good story. And these same people said, are you treating us like kindergarten? Hired her later to go in and talk to you about performance improvement. So she mapped out and showed people how to do this kind of work around performance improvement through pictures. And again, Gary always says, if you can't draw it, you can't understand it. And we agree with that, because if you can't draw it, you can't understand it. So that's where sort of, if you can draw a picture of the organization, you can understand it.
Mm-hmm. Then in chapter 5, that's titled Implementation, Weaving Performance into the Organization.
Well, that's another thing too. To get sustainability, if you just bring in some type of an approach, you don't get it into the organization. And sustainability, we thought you had to weave it into the organization someplace. So we always said, where is this process, or where is this going to fit into the organization? And that's what we just had figured out all a long time ago. So a lot of times we saw if you kind of bolt on some type of performance improvement approach, it doesn't get implemented. And again, one of the things that we often thought about is that when a problem would come to us, the first thing we talked about is that, how are we going to implement this thing? And who's going to be involved in implementing it? So we thought about implementing it in the first place, and that's when we got the stakeholders involved in doing this. And so it just made it a lot easier for us to think that we didn't own anything. The client owned everything, and how to get them involved. So how to get the whole system thinking about what do we do to get this thing going? That's how that came about. So implementation and sustainability through ownership.
Chapter 6 is titled What We Do.
Well, people often ask me, what do you do anyway as performance improvement consultants? And I think that's the idea when it going back to, I think you mentioned earlier, RSVP. So one of the things that we try to make it simple, because we thought about people could think of where results, we think from a standpoint of results focused. So we're results oriented. So what we do is always think about what's the end in mind. Then the next thing, and I think I learned that from back in the lab days at TMI and Westinghouse Learning Corporation, where I tried to figure out what we wanted to accomplish in mind and have in mind. So the accomplishment became an important consideration for us. So that's the results focus, the accomplishment focus. The next bit was the systems thinking, which I've already mentioned. And again, I just loaded up on systems thinking as much as I understood. It's really not, and it's silly. I learned a lot of things about systems thinking through Klaus Wipken also. And that's a whole nother approach from that standpoint. I think he's one of the better systems thinkers we have today. The value was the measurement. And Judy Hale has a great information around how to measure this stuff. So I learned a lot from Judy around measurement and just saying, and I also often brought these people into work at Wells Fargo, and she helped us measure what we was trying to accomplish along the way. So I just built that into our system, our thinking as we along. And then partners, of course, who are our partners and who are our stakeholders, and I always had them involved in the program. So that was what we do, how we think in the organization. And again, everybody needs to be involved in it in some way. So that was the idea.
So the chapter 7, a focus forward. Now your book was written and published in 2009, and this chapter is focus forward, trends to watch. So can you talk a little bit about what you were looking at in terms of trends back then, and how they may have sustained themselves or changed over time here, 12 years later, 13 years later?
Well, one of the biggest trends that Roger Kaufman was just starting to talk about, is his social impact, societal impact.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd known Roger for a long time. He'd also taught in the institutes. And so I started picking up and more or less following. So that was one of the biggest trends that we thought would have some type of impact in the future. Now, unfortunately, we didn't really pursue that aspect of it. Later on, Roger and I wrote several papers around, which I called the world. He called it societal impact, where we're talking about the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he and I wrote several articles around that, how we can impact the world using performance improvement. And his model around how do you improve performance for tomorrow's child, which is very, very future focused, if you really think about it. So it's, again, go back to building performance systems around that. So I was glad to be involved with Roger. I've been very lucky along the way to have been involved with a lot of these people and learning some of the things that they have taught me, and not only me, but the whole profession around performance improvement.
Chapter 8 then is on chart your course. So
Right.
Cover there.
Well, we also believed, and still do believe, is that you have to be able to educate yourself and introduce yourself to some of these people and some of the tools and the techniques along the way. So it's up to you, to keep involved in how to improve performance. Again, that you need to chart your own course. You can't wait for somebody else to do it. So that was the idea. And we have some tools in there that would help you just keep track of some of the things that you need to do. But again, there are so many things on the internet now that I certainly didn't have available to me, including the website, HPT website, the treasurer site, that we just didn't have. But you now go on to Google performance improvement, and there are so much information. It just becomes, you can become saturated into it. So chart your own course that way. And there's so much free stuff out there. I can't believe how much things that don't cost anything for anybody. And I think some of the interviews that you've been doing lately, Guy, have been very helpful in the idea of charting your own course. We can do that. So that's what I believe. And then again, tune into a workshop, join a chapter. My plug is the Bay Area chapter. They have great, for $50 a year, you can join that chapter, and they have really great seminars and workshops where you can learn from people month after month. And not only there, but Chicago, I think some chapters, Potomac chapter has some great webinars and seminars that are at no cost. So, I mean, if you can't do that, and then you can also go to Boise State and get a good degree in this stuff, which I didn't have that opportunity to do.
Yeah, there's a lot of great resources now, and Boise State chapter is a virtual chapter, so you can be anywhere in the world and participate in what they have to offer.
Right.
So do you have the book handy? Let's hold it up here and show the audience what it looks
Here's my book.
Yeah.
It's, you can see all these yellow tags. It's because I still use it when I start looking at it from the standpoint of what I need to find out about performance improvement, because you know, if you don't have your resources around you, you forget. And so not only do I have my resources here, but on the walls behind me, I've got every book I can think of around performance improvement. And the book has also been translated into Chinese, which was a great value to us. Now, I don't read Chinese, but at least they tell me that it works out very nicely. But the models are in there, and the same format is all the way through.
Mm-hmm. So the book is out of print, but it's available used. So wherever you might purchase a used book, you can do that. It's available through Amazon. And you and I both have Kindle versions of the book, but it's not available as a Kindle right now. So that's something that needs to be investigated to find out.
Yeah, I'll check on that, because it doesn't make any sense. They can put it on Kindle just as easy as not.
Yeah.
Again, publishers are interesting. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, that's better. You're better left.
I'll leave that alone.
Well, Roger, thank you so much for sharing with us an overview of your book. It's one of the classics, I believe, and I found it very valuable. Again, I used to own the paperback version of the book, and now I own the Kindle book. I'm not sure what happened to the paper book after all these years. Somebody probably borrowed it, and I forgot who that was. But again, thank you. The book is Performance Architecture, written by Roger Addison, Lynn Kerny, and Haig, and from back in 2009. It'll be a great addition to anybody's library. But any final words about performance improvement in general that you have for our audience before we wrap up?
Well, I don't have any final words, but my plug again, go to HPT Treasures, because it is a treasure. And you'll see some of the models I've already talked about already there. And everybody else, I mean, you've got interviews, you've got everything else I think a performance improvement specialist would find of extreme value. And particularly if you're a student just coming up, I suggest you join the Bay Area chapter. You can get some valuable information that way. And just go out and read, and do, and talk to a lot of people. The more you talk, the bigger your network is, the more valuable I think you find all these tools and resources.
Yes, well, thank you. So Roger, thanks again, and you have a great day. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Talk to you later.